Nationals taking on the Giants, also available streaming live on the ESPN app. Meanwhile, in the association, the Spurs have their eyes on Chris Paul and are considering making a run at him, according to our Mark Stein. Meanwhile, league sources are saying the Clippers aren't taking the threat of losing Paul lightly. Now, keep in mind, the Clippers can outbid any suitor for Paul. He's eligible for a 5-year deal worth an estimated $205 million from L.A. Stephen A., if CP3 joins the Spurs, what impact will this really have on the Western Conference?
Nothing. Not much at all. They'll be good enough to get back to the Western Conference Finals, and then they'll go home. It'll be a big deal for CP3 because he's never played in the Conference Finals. And I happen to believe he is a great point guard and a great player. But he's undersized, you know, and he's not a top 5 player. When you're talking about super teams, you're talking about 2 of the top 5 players in the world being on the same squad. Kawhi Leonard may be that guy, but Chris Paul is not a top 5 player. He's a top 5 point guard, but he's not a top 5 player. He still has to go against Golden State with the arsenal that they'd have in play, because I'm told that both Steph Curry and Kevin Durant will end up staying in Golden State beyond this season. And so when you look at it from that perspective, what's he going to do? The San Antonio Spurs were in the conference finals without him. They lost in the conference finals without him. The same thing would likely happen again with him. That's really what the situation is right now. And the only thing I'd like to say other than that is that if CP3 were to leave the Clippers, that's not a good look for Doc Rivers. You can't have a CP3, your best player, because CP3 is clearly their best player. You can't have CP3 want to leave you when you're in a position to offer him $50 million more than anybody else can. And he still leaves you. That would not be a good look for Doc Rivers at all. That much I will say.
CP3, a lot of CP3 news out right now, including David Stern, the former commissioner, throwing Mitch Kupchak under the bus about that scuttled trade. Stern is painted as the villain there. I think he looks worse for really destroying Kupchak here than even Kupchak did. But Kupchak also looks terrible because it turns out, according to Stern, had Kupchak not panicked, CP3 would have been a Laker, and then the whole, you know, recent history of the West could have been different. CP3, Kobe, Dwight Howard with maybe Phil Jackson as the coach. Maybe they still don't win a championship, but then the fortunes of the NBA, the outcomes change over several seasons. I thought that was big news. Then this is big news. Yeah. Well, yeah, you never know. And then this is big news also. Look, Popovich with CP3 is a scary proposition. Because I always thought watching the Spurs, watching Tony Parker, boy, Parker looks like a Hall of Famer. And I used to think, what if he had a point guard like Chris Paul? You know, a guy who is a Hall of Famer wherever he is, and you give that to Popovich in that system with those guys. I think Chris Paul over-dribbling ends with Popovich. Anything you don't like about Chris Paul, and there's not much not to like about him, ends with Popovich. Maybe he rubs certain teammates the wrong way. The way his leadership style can be abrasive. With the Spurs and Popovich, I believe all that gets fixed. And him and Kawhi would be a whole lotta. And LaMarcus Aldridge, I think, with Chris Paul, would be the best version of himself. The problem is LaMarcus Aldridge is not a great defensive player. And when the Spurs were at their best, their big, first David Robinson, then both, and then Tim Duncan, was not only a great offensive player, but a great defensive player. And that made the Spurs a whole different kind of ballgame. If LaMarcus Aldridge was a great defensive player too, then I would say actually Chris Paul joining him and Kawhi Leonard and the Spurs under Popovich with a supporting cast that they'll put together, you know what? The Warriors might be in trouble, but that's not LaMarcus Aldridge. And so ultimately, they won't have enough. And this goes back to my earlier point about the NBA, Stephen A. This is a built-in advantage of the NBA, and it's also a disadvantage. The advantage, you know, trade-offs, as I said. The advantage is the the best team wins. If you want to argue or quibble about all the time, most of the time, I'd say all the time, but the vast majority of the time, the best team wins, because it's not a one and done like in the NCAA tournament, and it's not a fundamentally probabilistic game like football or baseball. A best of 7 in basketball, best team's going to win. And so what that does, it means that right now you and I can say with a fair degree of certainty, even if Chris Paul goes to the Spurs, they'll take us on a roller coaster ride. They might be up 2-1 at some point on the Warriors, but ultimately they ain't going to win a best of 7. And that detracts from the drama of the NBA somewhat because it's more clear than in other sports who's the best.
Well,
that said, Chris Paul joining Kawhi brings them closer. It brings them closer.
One of the things that we have to discuss while we're doing this topic is that the question is being asked, what impact would Paul joining the Spurs have on the West? Well, it has a rippling impact because then now we ask questions, what is Blake Griffin going to do? Remember, he has the option to opt out, look for a new deal, whether it's in Los Angeles or somewhere else. DeAndre Jordan will be able to do that next summer as well. And so you're talking about the Clippers and what's going to happen to them. And obviously those are formidable players, whereas they may not be great together. If you added them to some of these other rosters, who's to say what they'll be able to do? That's point number one. Point number two, my sources tell me something, Max, when I ask the question, because I'm very fond of Chris Paul. I'm very fond of him as a person. I'm very fond of him as a player. I think he's terrific in both regards. I'm a huge fan of his. But everybody is not. What they talk about with Chris Paul is that they say, excuse me, Stephen A., has he really, really gotten better? And I'm like, what are you talking about? They said, look at his skill set when he came into the league. He had this game. Where has he evolved? We look at Steph Curry, how he came into the league, and we look at how his skill sets have evolved. We look at Russell Westbrook. We say the same thing. We look at the modifications that James Harden made to his game, and we see there's an elevated level of play. When it comes to Chris Paul, because I was fighting with them about this. They were like, Stephen A., go back to the film. There's not much different about Chris Paul. The great player that he is, he always was. But the process of evolution has never taken place. He hasn't evolved as much as people would like. Then they point to
might be a good reason for that, though.
Hold on. They point to friction within the Clippers. And you could speak to this, Max, because you was hosting the Afternoon Drive radio show in Los Angeles, where you got folks, and they're saying his relationship with players should be better. They're saying stuff like this about him right now. I don't find that to be true because I find him to be an individual that has put guys in positions to win because his talents are surreal and he's a great point guard. But they say this kind of stuff about him. Right now, they're saying this stuff.
Well, two things. Let me just comment on those two things real quick, Stephen A.
Sure.
One, the evolution of his skills. He's 2 feet tall. He's not even that fast, and he's one of the best players on earth. Where is there chance for evolution of his skills? He has such a great, well-rounded game.
Shot.
That's why I say maybe Popovich. Yeah, he can shoot, though. It's not like he can't shoot, and he can hit it when you need him.
I agree. I'm just telling you what they're saying is he could have been more of a three-point marksman. That's what they're saying.
I think Popovich will cure whatever's left that ails him. There's not much. And here's the question. This may be the number one thing. The teams he plays on don't seem to play with joy. They don't seem to all be pulling in the same direction and playing for each other. And that comes down to personality, and that's much more difficult to address.
Yep. So the bottom line is the Spurs essentially with CP3 still can't overtake that super team up north there in the West. When we come back, gentlemen, King James managed to beat the Warriors in the finals last season. So now that Golden State is the super team of all super teams, will he reach GOAT status? And speaking of LeBron's roadblock, is Kevin Durant's legacy on the line this year, or is it even fair to talk about it yet? Stay tuned. Will Kane will join us for that conversation.